I'm going to do three main things in this 45 minutes or so that I'm going to take at the beginning. I'm going to assume that most of you, or almost all of you, have not read my book, so I'm going to talk a lot about what's actually in the contents of the book. And the book is concerned with a number of different issues. Defending Constantine is, as my normal disclaimer is that was not my chosen title, but it does capture some important parts of the book. What I'm trying to do is, on the one hand, give what I think is what I'm trying to make is a more accurate account of the first Christian emperor than is popular in Christian circles today, and in the popular mind with books like Dan Brown's novels and so on, and try to assess Constantine as a historical figure in his own time, and try to explain and rebut some of the mythologies that have grown up around Constantine. So that'll be the first part. Who was Constantine as a man? What kind of person was he? What kind of emperor was he? And that'll be the bulk of my presentation tonight. The second thing I want to do, though, and the thing that interested me in this project as much as anything, was to deal theologically with the anti-Constantinian momentum or impulse that animates a lot of contemporary theology. And I'm thinking particularly here of Mennonite theologian by the name of John Yoder, who is probably the most influential, most important Mennonite theologian in history, and has a great deal to offer, I think, to non-Mennonites. But a central theme of his theology is an opposition to what he calls Constantinianism. And I wanted to examine that, and so part of my presentation tonight will be a summary of my response to Yoder and his disciples, perhaps definitely the most well-known of which is Stanley Hauerwas at Duke University. And then I didn't want the book to be only a critique. My aim was to criticize and to correct some of the historical accounts of Constantine and his period as emperor. I wanted to rebut the anti-Constantinian theological perspective, but I didn't want to leave it with just those that negative critique. So what I tried to come up with in the book was a positive account of Constantine, not positive in the sense of defending him, but positive in the sense of an account of Constantine that explains where I think he fits into the history of Christianity and of Western civilization. And that will lead in this evening to some discussion about how this whole this set of historical issues has an impact on our understanding of politics and Christian responsibilities in politics today. This is a Center for Applied Christian Ethics, so I hope to end on something that's more directly relevant, although it may not initially seem to be so. So those are the three things: Constantine as man and emperor, anti-Constantinianism as a movement within theology, and then an account of Constantine, how he fits into the history of the West, with some insight, I hope, to our contemporary political circumstances. First off, Constantine as man and emperor. The common idea that goes back into at least to the 19th century. For many centuries, of course, Constantine was considered a saint of the church. He was the first Christian emperor who ensured that Christianity would be and remain a legal religion. He was the builder of Constantinople, and therefore set the foundation for the Eastern Roman Empire and transformed the Western Roman Empire into a Christian empire. So for many centuries, he was considered a saint and a great hero of the faith. But there has been, over the last century and a half at least, there's been a good bit of criticism of Constantine on a number of fronts. That he was insincere, not truly a Christian, never really converted. The mythologies that you hear about, the stories of the cross in the sky, are concocted by apologists for Constantine and didn't really happen. He pretended to convert or went along with Christianity or supported the church for politically interested reasons. He saw that the church was a growing power in the Roman Empire, and he wanted to hitch himself to that increasingly important institution within the Roman Empire. So he's operating out of political interest and not out of genuine religious conviction. And he was really hadn't made no changes in the way that the Roman Empire functioned. He was just as brutal and bloodthirsty as any non-Christian Roman emperor, and he didn't really make any significant changes in the empire. That was the portrait of Constantine that I wanted to address and rebut. And the first question I want to address is the question of whether he was in fact a Christian. And that goes back to the accounts of his conversion. There are, in fact, not one but two accounts of his conversion that come from contemporaries. One of them describes the scene that we've all heard about, and the scene that's often depicted in paintings, a scene where Constantine sees a cross in the sky with a sign. That's the way that Eusebius's account is often read. There's a sign that says, "In this sign conquer." There's some kind of banner, some kind of inscription. There are many famous paintings of this. They have a flying cross and a banner coming from that in hoc signa, in this sign conquer, and in hoc signum for those Latin experts out there. And that's Eusebius' account. Lactantius, around the same time, also a contemporary of Constantine, gives a different account and describes instead a dream on the eve before battle. And I think those accounts are historical accounts. I don't think that they're made up, and I think they're actually describing two different incidents. I'm basing this conclusion on a study by a German scholar named Peter Weiss, who describes these two incidents as being separated by a couple of years. He points out that there are very different circumstances that are described by these two writers. One of them describes a public event that not only Constantine, but all of his men witnessed. And then the other describes a private dream of Constantine on the night before the battle that led to his conquest of the city of Rome. And Weiss says that these are two separate incidents, and they were both incidents that were interpreted for Constantine, at least over time, as signs from the Christian God. And what he suggests, and I think this might sound like a naturalistic explanation of what happened, but I think it actually fits with the 4th century context and the kind of mentality that a 4th century Roman emperor would be operating with. Weiss suggests that what Constantine saw is not a vision of a cross in the sky with an inscription flapping and angels coming down and the heavens open, but he saw what a natural phenomenon known as a sun halo. Ice crystals around the sun in the clouds sometimes form a halo around the sun. You can get on Google and find lots of nice images of sun halos that actually look like a circle around the sun, and the sun rays make a cross inside the circle. Weiss suggests that he saw, while marching with his troops around sometime in 310, saw this cross in the sky and wondered about it, pondered it for a couple of years, and in 312, the night before he went to fight his rival Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a dream, which is also interpreted as a dream, Christian dream, given a Christian interpretation. These two signs together led him to conclude that the Christian God had approved him, and that the Christian God was the true God. The Christian God had given him, promised him that he would win the battle and he would become the emperor. And I say that fits with the 4th century context and the mentality of a 4th century Roman emperor. What I'm thinking of is that any spectacular event in the heavens for a 4th century Roman is going to be interpreted as some kind of sign from the gods. Constantine already has some Christians in his court. At that time, he has Christians that he can consult, and when he consults these Christians, say, "I saw this spectacular sign in the sky, this circle of light, and then it looked like there was a cross in the middle," and they say, "Oh, we know who that is," and they give it a Christian interpretation, and he takes it as a sign from the Christian God specifically, and after winning the battle, considers that God has given him the victory and commits himself after that to serving this God. And there are, in fact, immediate consequences to that. Immediate consequences that I think in our post-Reformation modern context don't sound like significant changes. But for a 4th century Roman, again, these are highly significant changes. One of the things that he did that everyone knows about is to change the battle standard for the Roman army. And he went into the Battle of the Milvian Bridge with a Christian sign on the battle standard. That seems like, we think of that as just kind of just external change. That's not really that important. But battle standards were exceedingly important for the Roman army. They were considered religious signs. They were part of the Roman effort to gain the favor of the gods that they claimed to be fighting for. And if you change the battle standard, you are publicly changing the God that's sponsoring this battle. That's the way that the Romans would have thought about it. That's certainly the way that Constantine thinks about it. When he goes into Rome after defeating Maxentius, he refuses to offer sacrifice to Jupiter, which would be a normal act for any Roman emperor who's just conquered anything, but especially who's conquered the capital city of Rome. He would have gone in and offered sacrifice to the chief of the gods, which Constantine does not do. Fairly soon after that, Constantine begins surrounding himself with Christian signs and symbols. Christian symbols appear on his coins over time. He begins to support the church in its building programs and so on. And there's a lot of public signs that he's supporting the church, and he's changed from endorsing the pagan gods of the Roman Empire to endorsing and following and trying to serve the Christian God. So that all could be explained as kind of self-interested political maneuvering. Again, that's the way that Constantine has often been understood. Part of my defense of Constantine was to argue that Constantine actually believed this. He didn't just pretend to go along with the Christian God or somewhat half-heartedly accept the Christian account of the world in order to gain their support, in order to be on the right side of this growing influential institution in the Roman Empire. The Christians at the time of Constantine probably constituted about 10% of the population of the empire. So it's not a large constituency anyway. And I don't think that Constantine's main reason for supporting the church was out of political interest. He really believed that the Christian God was the God of the creation. He believed he was the creator God. That appears, that's evident in a number of his decrees. His imperial edicts, with some frequency, make reference to the Christian God, and make reference to the Christian God in ways that show that Constantine believed that that Christian God exists, and he believes that that Christian God has to be pleased in order for the Roman Empire to survive and to prosper. This is from one of his decrees. I'm going to give a little bit of more background before I read this. Constantine was very concerned about the unity of the church. That's, again, often seen as a kind of a sociologically or politically interested maneuver. He wants to unify the church to provide a kind of social glue for the Roman Empire. That's a perspective that I don't think a 4th century Roman or 4th century Christian really had in mind. They didn't think in sociological or political science terms. They thought in religious terms. And when Constantine is insisting on the unity of the church, he's insisting on the church's unity because he knows that if the church is divided and the church is at war internally, then God will be displeased, and therefore God will not show his favor to the Roman Empire. There's a political interest there, but it's a political interest that's inseparable from a theological conviction. He believes that the Christian God will support and favor Constantine and the Roman Empire as long as he does everything he can to make sure that the Christian church throughout the world remains unified. So that's the impulse behind this statement from one of his decrees. He said that he could be truly and most fully without anxiety, and may always hope for all the most prosperous and excellent things from the ever-ready kindness of the most powerful God. He could be sure of that and be free from anxiety only if he could ensure that all, bound together in brotherly concord, adore the most holy God with the worship of the Catholic religion that is his due. That's a fairly common kind of statement in the edicts that we have from Constantine, a direct reference to the Christian God, to the support and maintenance of a unified Catholic church, universal church, and he sees that as having a political import, but he expresses that as a Christian. Eusebius, in his certainly biased account of the life of Constantine, tells us that Constantine regularly preached at court. He turned his court basically into a Sunday school, and he would study and then preach sermons to the court. We only have one of those extant. Eusebius says that there were many, but Eusebius, in his life of Constantine, appends one of those orations that's called the Oration to the Assembly of Saints. These are the words of Constantine himself. There's been some debate among scholars about whether it was genuine. The consensus today is that it is a genuine product of Constantine's own hand, certainly with the consultation with the Christians at his court, but something that Constantine both wrote and delivered to the members of his court. And in this oration, he defends monotheism against polytheism, but not just monotheism in general. He specifically defends Christian monotheism. He refers to the debates about the generation of Christ, the generation of the Son that were going on around the time of the Nicene Council, and shows that he understands some of the basic issues that are going on there, and endorses the eternal generation of the Son, which is one of the Nicene, one of the cruxes of the Nicene, the pro-Nicene position. He summarizes the New Testament story of Jesus in this oration. He shows that he's aware of the gospel story, at least in its general contours, and he discusses a number of Old Testament prophecies that he says are fulfilled in Jesus, as well as a text from Virgil, which he also thinks is fulfilled in Christ. So far as I know, that's the first time you have the use of Virgil as a typological source for Christian theology. There may be some precedent for that. I don't know. So all of that to say, and there's a lot more evidence of that sort. All of that to say that I believe Constantine was not only converted, that he actually experienced some sign that he took as a sign from the Christian God, but that he actually came to the conviction that this God was his judge, that he needed to please this God in order to prosper and survive as a Roman emperor. He was not, however, baptized until his death. And this is a point that I mentioned in my book. I give the account of his baptism toward the end of the book, but reviewers have pointed out, I think rightly, that I should have paid more attention to that oddity of Constantine's life, that he was not a baptized believer until his deathbed, which means that throughout the time that he was issuing edicts in the name of the Christian God, supporting the church and helping to build churches, sitting in on the Council of Nicaea, although he didn't, I don't believe he directed it as many people have said, but he's sitting on the Council of Nicaea surrounded by bishops, and he, as a non-baptized professing believer, is present there. That's an oddity that I should have made more of in my book that I didn't. So was he a Christian? Depends on how you define that. Does he really believe what he's saying? I believe he does. He never entered into the church in the formal way of baptism until his deathbed. And the account that Eusebius leaves us of that baptism shows that he recognized that this was a transition from being outside to being inside the faith. He recognized that baptism was that kind of moment. But he put it off until his life was nearly over. Another question that comes up in the life of Constantine, did his conversion make any real difference in the way that he ruled? Did it make any difference in the way that the Roman Empire operated? And the answer to that is a yes and no answer, as it is with many historical questions. There are changes for the good. Probably the most significant ones would be the decision of Constantine early on after his victory over Maxentius at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. The Edict of Milan, so-called Edict of Milan, was issued, which didn't really grant toleration to Christians. That was already established in both the Eastern and Western Empire, but reimbursed Christians for lost property that had been taken from them during the persecutions that had just preceded Constantine. But what that Edict of Milan, although it was fairly narrow in its immediate effect, became a symbol of the recognition of the church as a legal entity. And there was, in the West, there was only a short period of time during the time of Julian the Apostate when that was reversed in any kind of fashion. The church had become a legal entity. It was established. There were no more persecutions after that, and the Edict of Milan is kind of a symbol of that shift. The other major thing that I think Constantine did that I think shows the shift in the legal and political system of the Roman Empire was his decision to open up church courts to litigants in the Roman legal system. What he allowed was on either side of a lawsuit in a Roman court, either side could appeal from the Roman civil courts to an episcopal court. And the civil courts had to relinquish jurisdiction over that case, and a bishop would take it up. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because though we often hear about the glories of the Roman legal and judicial system, the Roman legal and judicial system was very biased in favor of the wealthy and the well-born. There are satirical accounts. They are satires, so not sure how literally we can take them, but there are satirical accounts of courtrooms where one of the parties in a lawsuit, being of the upper class and a good friend of the judge, is actually sitting on the judge's bench and whispering in his ear during the court case. Maybe that never happened, but that was the impression that many people had of the Roman system. If you were wealthy, you could keep appealing a case and then appeal it again and then appeal it again against a poorer adversary. And the poor adversary would eventually have to give up, no matter how just his cause was, because he just couldn't keep paying the bills of continuing to go to court. What Constantine did by permitting cases to be transferred to ecclesiastical courts was to provide free access to a court presided over, presumably, though I'm sure not in every case truly, presumably by somebody who was more fair-minded than many of the judges in the Roman legal system. So now a bishop is going to decide between these, and he doesn't cost anything. He's supposed to be, and many of the bishops were, in fact, impervious to bribes and threats from the wealthy members of Roman society. This is a huge benefit especially for the lower class and poorer members of Roman society who didn't have any legal recourse beyond this, who would quickly run out of money and could be just squeezed out of their case by continuing appeals by a wealthier adversary. That's a very significant shift also a very significant shift of power toward the church, as you can imagine. Now the church is going to take up, and many of the early church fathers complain about this. They spend all their days trying to break up fights between their congregants because all their cases, all the civil cases now come to the bishop. Augustine and others complain about the amount of time they spend with quarrelsome parishioners. So there are some significant changes in the direction of a more just and a genuinely more Christian system. There are more examples that I give in the book, but those are a couple of them. At the same time, Constantine was, in many ways, just like earlier non-Christian emperors. He eliminated rivals directly or indirectly. The reason he became the sole emperor, there had been a system where there were 4 different emperors prior to Constantine. The reason he became the sole emperor was because he was able to defeat all of his rivals, most of them family members, people he was related to one way or another. He was able to defeat them in battle or was able somehow to arrange for their untimely demise or their exile, or both. Usually the exile first and then the untimely demise. And there's a famous story that's preserved about his son Crispus and his second wife Claudia, and how Claudia was drowned according to the accounts that we have. Crispus was exiled and killed after being exiled. The circumstances of that are murky, and it's not clear at all what happened in that circumstance. It's likely or possible at least that there was some kind of an affair between Constantine's wife and his oldest son from a previous marriage, or at least that was the accusation, and perhaps Crispus was framed. But that's a significant blot on his record. However it happened, and whatever the circumstances were, it just doesn't look good for him to be emperor when his wife and his oldest son are executed. So Constantine certainly isn't an entirely admirable emperor in those respects. That's all I'm going to say about the first part, and I'll try to. I have to be more rapid with the next couple of sections. That was the bulk of the book that defending Constantine is about those historical issues and trying to sort through what actually Constantine did, what he didn't do, how he influenced the church, and how things have been inflated or distorted by historians. The other part, and the part that interests me more, has to do with the theological category of anti-Constantinianism. Anti-Constantinianism is an old position, going back to some medieval writers who thought that the alliance of the church and state that occurred during and after the time of Constantine was the fall of the church. That certainly is the position of the Anabaptists at the time of the Reformation period. And that becomes a permanent thread of Western thought and culture during the modern period. The more recent form of anti-Constantinianism comes from John Howard Yoder, as I mentioned, And he provides a very sophisticated, I think a very powerful critique of what he calls Constantinianism that I think has a great many strengths to it. It's an important paradigm but I believe it has some significant weaknesses. When Yoder talks about Constantinianism, he's not talking about Constantine as a person. He's not talking about the policies that Constantine adopted. He's not talking about the circumstances in the short reign of Constantine in the early 4th century AD. He's talking instead about a shift in the church's relationship to the world and a shift in the church's understanding of itself that occurred sometime around the 4th century in Constantine's conversion. He thinks it begins sometime in the 2nd century. You see this accommodation happening with the world, and he thinks it continues really on with periodic protests. It continues on well into the modern period in different forms. But it's not about Constantine himself. He calls it Constantinianism because Constantine's conversion and the way that he permitted Christianity and initiated the process that led to a Christian empire. Constantine is a good symbol of what Yoder's getting at. And he sees this as a massive betrayal of the early Christian practice and the gospel. A massive betrayal in a couple of ways. He thinks that there are significant changes in Christian practice, and particularly Christian practice in relation to war and political life. Yoder believes that and argues that the early church was, he hesitates to use the word pacifist because of it can be an anachronistic term to apply to the early church, but he thinks that the early church was pretty uniformly opposed to Christians fighting in wars. After Constantine and with Constantinian coming in, you have the development of just war theory, and Christians begin to defend Christian involvement in wars. And he sees that as a significant betrayal of the early church, of the early church's practice, and also he thinks of the New Testament gospel. Just as significantly, he thinks that the church lost a sense of itself, a sense of its own identity. The early church saw itself as a world unto itself, saw itself as a separate city existing within the Roman Empire, but certainly not of the Roman Empire. And with the conversion of Constantine, that changes. The early Christians saw the church itself as the institutional, visible carrier of meaning in history. That's the phrasing that Yoder uses. He thinks the early Christians believe that where's the action of human history happening? Where's the really important stuff happening? Early Christians would have said it's happening in our Eucharistic assemblies, or as we evangelize our neighbors, as the gospel grows. That's where the real action is. After Constantine, he says there's a shift so that the church begins to highlight political life, a series of emperors, kings, and so on as that's where the real meaning of history is going on. That's where the action is. That's who's in control of history. Just the whole idea that human beings can be in control of history is something that Yoder attributes to the rise of Constantinianism. Christians, in early Christians, he said, would have believed in providence, but it's an invisible providence. It's not a providence that's embodied in any kind of political institutions outside the church. But with the coming of Constantine, then Christians begin to think we can manipulate and control where history is going. And Yoder sees that again as a massive betrayal of the early church's consciousness. Another aspect of Constantinianism is the development of a bifurcated church, which he thinks leads to a bifurcated dualistic kind of ethic and a dualistic metaphysics. What he's talking about is the influx of half-converted people into the church that happens at the time of Constantine. Now it's legal, not only legal, but over time becomes encouraged for Romans to be part of the church. If the emperor's part of the church, it might be a good thing to be in the church. So people come into the church for all kinds of reasons, not because they were truly convinced that Jesus was the Messiah. In the early church, it took a good bit of persuasion. You had to be convinced that this was the right thing to do because you were going to be persecuted. You could face all kinds of ostracism and even death if you confessed openly that you're a Christian. After Constantine, it's really easy to be a Christian. And because of that, you have a core of genuine, sincere believers, and you have this outer fringe of people who are just hangers-on. You have this dualistic kind of church, which Yoder thinks is the background. That's the actual historical background to the development of theories of visible and invisible church. And he thinks that's a background to the development of, again, a dualistic kind of ethic for the church. There's certain people in the church that really have to live like Christians, like the early Christians did. And those are the monks, and those are sometimes the bishops and the priests. But then there's all these other people who can kind of go on with their life as they lived it before, give it a little covering of Christian, a little gloss of Christianity, but they can basically go on living their natural lives without really being transformed by the gospel. That dualistic ethic in the church and that dualistic ecclesiology, the idea that you have a visible and invisible church, he thinks is also linked up to the development of dualistic kind of metaphysics in the early church. So those are some of the things that he associates with Constantinianism, some of the reasons why he is opposed to it. And I think there are very good reasons to be opposed to many of the things that he's opposed to. I think that the church's loss of self-consciousness, it does happen, at least to some degree. Certainly at various points in history, to some degree at the time of Constantine, the church lost its consciousness of being a separate community. I don't think it's as drastic or as permanent as Yoder thinks it is, but that's certainly something that does happen in early church and in the history of the church. I'm just as opposed to dualism as Yoder is in all its forms and pomp and show. But I think that Yoder is also mistaken in some important ways. He's historically mistaken, I think, in a number of respects. I'm not persuaded that the early church was as uniformly pacifist as he claims it is. And I think he needs to have that thesis defended. He needs to have a uniformly or a mostly uniformly pacifist early church in order to make the case that he does for Constantinianism as a betrayal. If the early church was a more mixed bag where some people were inclined in a pacifist direction, but you also had Roman soldiers who were Christians who continued to do their Roman soldiering, if that's the case before Constantine, before Constantinianism begins to rise, and then after Constantine, you still have that same mix of things. That seems to be a more accurate portrait of what actually goes on. It's very difficult to find out exactly what early Christians, you can't count noses what all the early Christians were thinking about war. But I think Yoder overstates what you can know about the early church and war. I think he's also mistaken on particular thinkers. One of the worst parts of Yoder is his account of Augustine, whom he characterizes as a Constantinian theologian, largely because Augustine lived and worked in a post-Constantine period when the empire was basically Christian. And his reading of Augustine is, I don't say this lightly about Yoder because I admire him in many respects, but I think it's thoroughly incompetent. I don't think he gives any kind of fair treatment to Augustine at all. That I think goes along with maybe a deeper issue with Yoder's work and his anti-Constantinianism, which is the implication that might be drawn. I don't think this is the way Yoder operates, but the implication that can be drawn that you have a compromised and perverted form of Christianity, basically from Constantine until the rise of the Anabaptist movement in the post-Reformation era. You have little pockets of faithfulness that appear every now and then, but you don't really have a solid, long-lasting movement, anti-Constantinian movement, until you get to the Anabaptists, which means you're missing about 1,000 years of church history and 1,000 years of Christian reflection, and more particularly 1,000 years of Christian reflection on political life. Yoder's paradigm for the history of the church makes that a big blank. There's no reason to consult these guys because they're all Constantinians. They're all compromised with the world. And I think that's a great fault. That would be a disastrous conclusion to draw. Perhaps my most fundamental objection, this will lead into the last part of my talk, my most fundamental objection to Yoder and Hauerwas and other anti-Constantinians is that I believe that they're still operating with a modernist liberal account of politics and the church. Liberalism, as I'm defining it, is not opposed to conservatism. Liberalism, as I'm defining it, is the order that liberals and conservatives and everyone in the modern age operates under. There are various components to it. Liberal order makes the individual the central political unit. not communities, not families, but individuals who are bearers of rights. Liberalism separates tries to separate pretty neatly between public and private. The public realm is a realm of reasoned debate. The public realm is the realm also of power. The public realm is basically the state, which has a monopoly of political power and a monopoly of violence. The private realm is a realm of irrational passions and loyalties, like families and churches. And so this public-private distinction means that theology and the church has to back out of the public square. That's what I mean by liberal order. And I think that for all their attacks on liberal order, and Yoder and especially Hauerwas are great opponents of liberal order, they end up being liberals. And they end up being liberals because they concede, in some important respects, they concede the realm of power to secular forces. They concede the realm of power to the amoral forces of interest and sheer power. In other words, another way to put it, you can put the same point from the opposite direction. They don't see any real possibility of redemption of the sphere of power. Power being used, political power being used in a Christian fashion. That seems to be outside of their imagination. That at least the earlier Hauerwas would have said things like that. I think Hauerwas has gone through a process where he's willing to speak in guardedly positive terms about Constantine and Constantinianism of a certain sort. He's taken to calling himself a theocrat, which I think is actually a much more fruitful direction to go. I would pose the question, or pose the issue this way. I think we either have to defend some form of Christendom, some form of public Christianity, where Christ and his kingship and his word are constitutive or governing in public life. We either have to say that, or we're going to end up as liberals, again, leaving the world of politics to just the play of force and interest, and the people who have the biggest guns win. That's comments about liberalism lead me into my last section, and I'll have to do this very briefly. But the practical side of this, or let me start here, the positive side of Constantine, the positive account of Constantine that I tried to provide, instead of seeing Constantine as basically marking the fall of the church, which is the way Yoder presents him, the betrayal of early Christianity and betrayal of the gospel, I tried to fit Constantine in a different narrative, and I see Constantine as the one who, as the emperor who sacrificializes. I'm not sure if I have the right word for this. I think I made up a word to express this. He removes sacrifice from the center of public life, which had been the center of public life from the beginning of human history. Romans, when Romans conquered, they offered sacrifice. When Romans were going out to fight, they would offer sacrifice. When Romans began their assemblies, political assemblies, they offered sacrifice. And by this I mean literal killing of animals and burning of animals, various kinds of sacrifice. They wanted to know what was going to happen. You read Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. You want to know what's going to happen in the Senate today? You slice open a goat and see what his entrails tell you. And if the lamb doesn't have a heart, then you probably shouldn't go to the Senate. But the sacrifice was at the center not just of religious life for the Romans, but it was the center of political life. It was the central religious act for almost all ancient peoples, including the Romans. It's also a central political act. And one of the achievements of Constantine is to remove sacrifice from that central position. He does it personally because he refuses to offer the sacrifices, the pagan sacrifices that were expected of a Roman emperor. Eusebius says that he actually outlawed sacrifice during the course of his period as emperor. That's debated, but I think it's true. Sacrifice was not immediately eliminated. The Roman emperors didn't have that kind of immediate clout that they could forbid something and then immediately it stopped. That's not the way that Roman imperial decrees worked. But he did forbid sacrifice, and over several centuries, sacrifice was gradually eliminated. So he's eliminating sacrifice from the center of Roman political life, and forming instead a very different sort of public order, where not the sacrificial systems of the Roman pagan temples, but the Christian non-sacrificial or Eucharistically sacrificial, that cult, that worship becomes central to the Roman order. The way I put it in the book is that I don't know if Constantine intended to do this or not, but in effect, what he declared by eliminating sacrifice from Roman public order and supporting the church, he basically declared that the church was the true city in the Roman Empire. For an ancient person, a city was a sacrificial order. Without sacrifice, you don't have a city. And if he's eliminating sacrifice from Roman public life and supporting the church, where the Eucharistic sacrifice is at the center of their worship, Eucharistic sacrifice understood in some sense, the Eucharistic meal, not endorsing a Roman Catholic view of the sacrifice of the Mass here. We could discuss that if you want. By eliminating the animal sacrifices and supporting, giving public support to Christian worship and to the Eucharistic sacrifice, that's a massive upheaval of Roman public life. That's a massive upheaval of ancient politics. I call this in my book the baptism of Rome, and by baptism I mean a transition from one world into another. When Israel goes out of Egypt, they undergo a baptism in the Red Sea. They pass through the Red Sea, and that passage marks the end of the old world that they were part of, the Egyptian world, and the beginning of a new world. It's not an instant beginning. There's a lot of things that are going to happen before they get to their destination, but that baptism marks a real transition in Israel's life. And I argue that the same thing is happening with Rome with the actions of Constantine, and particularly with his actions regarding sacrifice. Eliminating sacrifice and supporting instead, giving public support instead to Christian worship and Christian Eucharistic sacrifice and celebrations. Now, the way this is the practical point of the lecture. So, talking about sacrifice probably doesn't sound real practical, but I think it's exceedingly practical. I think this is where the whole history of Constantine, if I'm accurate in thinking of the major effect he has on the history of the West, is to remove sacrifice from public life. Really, to remove sacrifice as an option for private life too. Just as a footnote or parenthesis here, think of how appalled we are when we hear these strange accounts of Wiccans going out into the woods and offering. Occasionally, you hear that people are offering sacrifices and actually killing animals and spreading the blood around and burning it. And we just think that is so bizarre. Why would anybody do that? That was the most common thing in the world to do. If you go back more than 2,000 years. The most common thing in the world, the most common religious act in the world, in every culture, was to kill animals, to spread blood around, and to sacrifice. And what happened to our consciousness in that way? We're just appalled by that. I think that's just a marker, to me that's a marker of the achievement that begins with Constantine in Western civilization. Because up until that point you still have, even though Christianity is growing within the Roman Empire, the public order of Rome is still sacrificially centered, and that's no longer the case after Constantine. But what you have, I think, in the modern world, in our world, is a reemergence of sacrificial political order. The nation state is a sacrificial system. The modern nation state is a sacrificial system. I'm using this rather charged language that I'm drawing from a Yale law professor named Paul W. Kahn. I've been reading some of his books recently, particularly a book called Putting Liberalism in Its Place. Let me read a couple of quotations from Kahn just to, I hope, stir up some discussion about this. The modern nation state, he says, has shown itself to be an extremely effective instrument of sacrifice. It's been able to mobilize its population to make sacrifices in order to sustain the state's own historical existence. The immense capacity of the nation state to sacrifice its citizens in war is the great political discovery of the 19th century. That discovery begins with Napoleon's armies inheriting the popular enthusiasm of the Revolution. It was further revealed in the American Civil War when democratic armies based on mass conscription confront each other for the first time. As the conception of citizenship and political participation broadened, so did the conception of the reach of military service. The people's state is supported by the people's army, and the army is sent out to offer itself in sacrifice for the maintenance of the state, or to sacrifice other people, to kill them for the maintenance of the state. Kahn sees this as a relocation of sacrifice in the history of the West, a relocation of sacrifice from the earliest examples we have of self-sacrifice, or the martyrs of the early church. But he thinks in the modern world what we have is a relocation of a sacrifice, a self-sacrifice in the name of Jesus against state power, into the modern age where we have a self-sacrifice in favor of state power, a new kind of martyrdom that takes the form of patriotism. This is what Kahn says. The Western state actually exists under the very real threat of Christian martyrdom, a threat to expose the state and its claim to power as nothing at all. That's what the martyrs do. The martyrs win because they show that the state's power ends with the power to kill. And if you got people who just don't mind being killed, the state doesn't, the state's power is exposed by the martyrs. And it's not accidental that you have some of the most intense persecution just before Constantine emerges and the whole system collapses. The martyr wields a power to defeat his murderer, which cannot be answered on the field of battle. And then this, I'll leave you with this. The domain of sacrifice shifted in modern politics from that of religious resistance to the state to that of political patriotism. Modern stories of sacrifice are less likely to be of religious resistance to the state than of individuals whose faith in the truth of the state, that is, the popular sovereign, fuels an ultimate resistance against those who make false claims to represent the people. For Americans, Lincoln becomes the great image of the martyr, a politicized Christ. Martin Luther King Jr., too, is celebrated not for his adherence to a religious claim to truth in resistance to the state, which is certainly what he thought he was doing, but Martin Luther King Jr. is celebrated instead as a sacrificial patriot in the Lincoln-esque tradition. So that all to say, and I think Kahn is right that this is, there you have the reemergence. Before I had come across Kahn's work, this was part of my argument at the end of defending Constantine, that you have this reemergence of a sacrificial political order in the modern state where you have ultimate claims, absolute claims made by the nation state, which demands of its citizens their willingness to kill themselves and to kill other people for the maintenance of that order. That, I think, is a reemergence of a kind of paganism. It's a reemergence of a kind of sacrificial order that Constantine had freed the West from. And far from wanting to bury Constantine, I think a revival of Constantinian order, that is, de-sacrificed order, is of great moment in our time. Thanks very much.
I want to thank Dr. Leithart for a wonderful presentation and a wonderful book. Actually, as you finished your talk, I was about to say, amen, any questions? And leave it at that. But I'm not going to do that because Vince told me, Dr. Baker told me I have to talk for 15 minutes. So, de-sacrificed is a made-up word. Microsoft Word told me so. So, thank you for that. At the back of the cover of Defending Constantine, N.T. Wright's endorsement is telling. This is what the bishop says. Too many people for far too long have been able to murmur the awful word Constantine, knowing that the shudder it produces will absolve them from the need to think through how the church and the powers of the world actually relate, let alone construct a coherent historical or theological argument on the subject. Peter Leithart challenges all these and forces us to face the question of what Constantine's settlement actually was and meant. Few will agree with everything he says. All will benefit enormously from this challenge to easygoing received wisdom. That's the end of the quote. And I, for one, am in complete agreement with the bishop. Let me begin this discussion then with three personal disclaimers. Disclaimer one, I do come from that old part of the world in which the Emperor Constantine as you mentioned, is not simply Constantine, but he's Constantine the Great. He sent Constantine, or more properly, the holy great sovereign Constantine, equal of the apostles, whose feast day is on May 21st, celebrated, by the way, with the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. So it was surprising to me, part of this disclaimer is that it was surprising to me that Constantine needs defending. Disclaimer number 2. I'm a trained historian of the early church, and therefore I approached this book as a historian. Disclaimer number 3. Though I read both Yoder and Hauerwas with great interest and affinity, I'm not an academic specialist in their work. You'll see in time why these 3 disclaimers. Now to the work at hand. Defending Constantine, the twilight of an empire and the dawn of Christendom, is a carefully woven narrative of a skillful writer with a penchant for the dramatic, a true storyteller in the best tradition of the craft. Apart, of course, from the sheer terror anything with the word twilight in the title invokes in me. I'm glad to hear that. They should have listened to you. Few editors ever do. Defending Constantine, however, is not a historical book. It is a book about history. Or by the author's own admission, it is a theological essay based on a retelling of the story of the 4th century. As such, the scope of this book is breathtaking, as you saw in the presentation. And its ends are clear. And as N.T. Wright suggests, few will agree with everything Dr. Leithart says. But Dr. Leithart will find me in full accord of the historical aspects of the story he tells. In his preface, Leithart warns the reader that his is not an unbiased telling of the story of Constantine, or of the 4th century, or of the relationship of the emperor with the church. His goal is to, quote, summarize the results of recent scholarship in order to take sides in those debates and to rebut the popular caricatures that are still widespread, end quote. A more accurate title might have been, it seems to me, Defending Constantine against Yoder. For as Leithart himself acknowledges, this book is a polemic, albeit a theological one, against Yoder and his followers, who, Leithart argues, quote, get the 4th century wrong in many particulars, and this distorts their entire reading of church history, end quote. At the core of the argument of this book is a lively debate on the very conception of the church, how one views the church diachronic as a diverse body that bears witness to Christ. As his first task, that of rebutting popular caricatures of the early church, Leithart will find me a staunch ally also. Reacting against mythological constructs of a primitive Christianity that never existed is always a good thing, not only for historians, but in our case, for all Christians. For as Gusto Gonzalez reminds us, responsible remembrance leads to responsible action, while the innocent history of a romanticized past that infuses some of the tellings of the story of primitive Christianity leads inevitably to a selective forgetfulness in order to avoid the consequence of a more realistic memory. To do so, Defending Constantine embarks in what seems to me to be the weaving of 3 books, not just 3 stories, 3 books in one. The first, chapters 1 through midway chapter 8, up to page 175, is a retelling of the story of Constantine as a Roman emperor and a Christian convert, providing a corrective to what the author proposes to be the, quote, received wisdom, end quote, on Constantine in the 4th century. In that retelling of the story, Jacob Burckhardt, the 19th century historian of the Renaissance, serves as the primary interlocutor. The second is a sustained debate with Howard Yoder and Stanley Hauerwas by extension, and on the truthfulness of the meaning of the story. The third seems to be the theological argument that infuses the historical narrative Leithart proposes and which he suggests nullifies or at least considerably weakens the prevalent arguments about Constantinianism and its effect, namely that not only did the church not fall in the 4th century, but on the contrary, that it was, quote, recognized and honored as the true city, end quote. In all this, Leithart succeeds in arguing that fall narratives, including that of Yoder, amount to a dangerous simplification of history that forced contemporary Christians into attainable and unattainable positions. This review, however, ought also to be somewhat critical of the argument, otherwise we could all go home, which may be exactly what you want to do, but at least so that we have something to talk about in the next 45 minutes or so. So let me lay some of the places where Leithart's argument seems to me to need some challenging. The first problem I encounter, and here's my disclaimer number 2, that I was trained as a historian and therefore I live, some people say too much, in the 4th century. I do not know popular culture. My children would attest to that. My students too. So when I hear popular perceptions of, I'm always perplexed by that. So my first problem as I read this book is that even though a fascinating read, full of wonderful insights and a beautifully woven story, this book may assume too much of its readers and give too little at the same time. That is, Leithart seems to assume that the non-specialist reader either are familiar with or can easily assess two things. First, the Hellenization hypothesis or thesis, out of which Burckhardt and Harnack wrote, and that saturated the mid-19th through the mid-20th century, the air that Yoder breathed as he studied, and with him everyone in biblical studies, as the book acknowledges on page 179, for example. And two, that they will agree with him, the audience that is, that he represents Yoder, Harwas, and the current Christian peacemaking tradition fairly. I'm refraining from using the word pacifist because it is indeed a tortured term. So I'll speak about Christian peacemaking. Since I have a very limited time to address this book, I will concentrate on 3 critiques, spending most of my time on chapter 12 titled The Pacifist Church, ? Or Pacifist Church, ? From the start, Leithart gives the reader the essence of the 5 questions that guide the argument in the essay. 1, did Constantine really convert? Really is underscored. 2, did Constantine control the church? 3, did Constantine determine orthodoxy at the Council of Nicaea? 4, did Constantine mandate that every Roman citizen become a Christian? 5, how did he treat pagans and Jews and heretics? The quick answer to the 5 questions is this. 1, how can we determine what really means? He died a baptized Christian after all, hence the adjective saint. 2, no. 3, no. 4, no. Theodosius I did in 395. 5, better than his predecessors and many of those who followed him. I'll elaborate. So I'll concentrate on 2 points, the argument against Burckhardt and the argument against Yoder. Here's where the historian in me gets me in trouble. For as I said, I do not know much about contemporary culture. Even though Leithart might well be right that in some parts of North American ahistorical popular culture, as he says, Constantine has been the whipping boy for a long time, Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code and James Carroll's Constantine's Sword, both of whom are set up from the beginning as representatives of that culture, would hardly be seen as reliable sources for any historian of any period, let alone the 4th century. Turning to the conspiracy theorizing of Dan Brown for historical insight may seem to be akin to turning to the governor of Texas for understanding the reasons we fought the American Revolution in the 16th century. As a historian, I was quite pleased to see that in the first 175 pages or so are a beautifully woven and accessible narrative that I would assign to students who do not have a background in Roman history. However, by setting Jacob Burckhardt as a primary historical interlocutor against whom he retells the story of Constantine, and proposing that Burckhardt's 1852 assessment of Constantine and Eusebius, or Eusebius and Constantine in that order, is still the prevailing historical narrative of our time, as he does especially in chapter 4, Leithart might open himself to the accusation of setting up a strawman argument. And that because while it is true that Burckhardt's mid-19th century work characterized Eusebius as, quote, the first thoroughly dishonest historian and the one who utterly falsified Constantine's image, these are Burckhardt's characterization of Eusebius and from which he informs his concept of the emperor himself. His argument has been repeatedly shown by at least the past generation of historians of the 4th century to be inaccurate and often wrong, greatly influenced and tainted by his particular reading of the life of Constantine, which he perceives to belong to the same category of works as the ecclesiastical history, something that is simply not true. One can hardly find a history book published in the past generation that would affirm such an interpretation of the 4th century. Leithart's telling of the story of Constantine is Eusebian at its core, and one heavily influenced by T.D. Barnes at that. And since I am sympathetic with the much-needed corrective Barnes has provided on the relationship between Eusebius and Constantine, I will not quibble too much with the historical details. Nonetheless, the historical question remains: can Eusebius be trusted as a source for understanding Constantine? The short answer is yes, but within the parameters of what the Bishop of Caesarea was trying to do. Barnes has shown that the Vita, the life, to which Leithart often turns, for example, was primarily written for the benefit of Constantine's 3 sons and heirs, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. In it, Eusebius pointed the 3 youth to their patrimony, a throne and a reign that was successful because of their fathers, and for Eusebius, their grandfathers also, protection of the Christian church. To be sure, Eusebius exaggerates quite a bit in his account of Constantine's life and does not hesitate to give the official account of his readings of their father in his deathbed, of his excuse for attacking Licinius, or Constantine's own version of his conversion. But he does that because he wants to make a point. And I would argue that his point is this: your father was successful and prospered because he had God's blessing upon him, for he had trusted God and protected his people, God's people. You better do the same. To treat it as history, as we now understand history, or the lens through which to interpret the rest of the story, would be unfair to the ancient writer. Why is this important? First, because Constantine cannot be easily separated from Eusebius. Secondly, because in arguing against Burckhardt, Leithart's telling of the story of Constantine is Eusebian at its core. But so is Yoder's. Let me say this. I think Yoder's reading of the fall of the church runs dangerously close to that stream of ahistorical anachronism that has a tendency to mythologize the past, and as such produce an unattainable standards that negate the real lives and struggles of men and women, past and present, to be faithful Christians in bedazzling pluriformity. But at the same time, it seems to me that Leithart makes the same mistake Burckhardt did, namely, in giving the life written between 337 and 39, before the fight between Constantine's sons had begun and left unfinished by Eusebius, all these are important qualifiers, only to be published after he died, the weight of historia, history as we understand it, rather than what it truly was, a warning addressed to Constantine's 3 sons, and not recognizing, or at least acknowledging more fully, the theological character of Eusebius' story, Leithart verges on hagiography. A number of places, pages 82, 83, 87, 93, 94, etc. As I mentioned earlier in the preface, Leithart warns the reader that it is not an unbiased telling of the story of Constantine, but neither was Eusebius's or Yoder's. On this point, as I read through the book, I was struck on how often Leithart was willing to give Constantine or Eusebius' account of Constantine the benefit of the doubt. Quote, this, and this is representative statement regardless of the rest of the story in this page. Quote, this might be evident that, ... but it seems more likely that, ... end quote. Is a repeated refrain that provides validation for almost everything Constantine did. For example, pages 227 page 125, for example, or the execution of Crispus and Fausta in 227 and 230. I will just mention this and we can pick it up later if you want. Leithart, to the contrary, who argues contra Yoder, page 178, his not so unexpected yet surprising claim that only Constantine's not so unexpected yet surprising claim that not only is he a bishop among bishops, but as the author of the Life called him, quote, truly a universal bishop appointed by God, end quote, whose purview was to convene councils for the care of the church, is kind of worrisome to me, especially as Peter said, by an unbaptized Christian. Don't miss the point. The Life, claims that in his very office, Constantine is responsible for universal order. But that is a very Roman claim, a claim reminiscent of the long-claimed duty of each emperor preceding Constantine and many who follow him, up to Justinian at least, to be the Pontifex Maximus and at the same time the augur of the state. So he's both responsible for the Pax Deorum, or the Pax with the one God, and as an augur, the one who says what that peace is. So he's both priest and interpreter at the same time. Every emperor is. Examining briefly Constantine's blatant attempt to be the is apostolos, equal to the apostles who crushed the head of the serpent with the help of the cross, Leithart, even as he acknowledges that there might be a less than pious explanation, gives Constantine a way out. This is what he says, page 94. All this seems damning, more an expression of Roman superbia than Christian humilitas. The emperor had a high opinion of himself, a sense of destiny, a deep conviction about his own importance in the history of Christ's kingdom. Yet, in one sense, all this is perfectly orthodox. As Christ, Jesus is the head of the body that shares in his resurrection and victory as much as his own cross, as in his cross. Though it is certainly Jesus, the seed of the woman who crushes the serpent's head, Paul also assured the Roman that the Lord would crush Satan under their feet. Romans 16. Constantine thought too highly of himself, but in thinking he could join Christ in crushing Satan, he was simply thinking like a Christian. Chronologies matter. Burckhardt understood Eusebius and Constantine in unison. One interpreted the other. Barnes' fine historical work has not only shed new light into Eusebian studies, but by providing an accurate and complete chronology of the bishop's work, Barnes has allowed us to reinterpret Eusebius, the historian, also very much in the vein Leithart does. And I know you had correspondence with Timothy, and that showed wonderfully well. The same has happened with the sustained challenge the last generation of patristic scholars has brought to the Hellenization thesis that permeated all branches of the academy from the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century and informed our views of primitive Christianity. These challenges have freed the early church from the presumed captivity to Greek philosophy imposed on it for over a century, and have allowed us to see the development of doctrine, for example, as organic development of vibrant, thinking, worshiping communities. And on that aspect of the telling of the story, Leithart is in the right. Chronologies matter, modern as much as ancient. When biblical scholars, historians, and theologians of the mid-20th century wrote, they assumed both of these, the Hellenization thesis and Eusebius' unreliable, even propagandistic history as sine qua nons. We need to remember that Yoder was trained in that tradition. One reading Leithart's description of Yoder's work, not being patient enough to come to page 179 to find a faint acknowledgement that Yoder was not alone in his interpretation of Eusebius, Constantine, and the 4th century, or as Leithart puts it, quote, Yoder is not entirely to blame for this, since mainstream scholarship has long considered Eusebius nothing more than a political propagandist, end quote, would conclude that the Mennonite theologian was making things up as he went. that he had already formed a theological thesis and was twisting the, quote, facts, end quote, of history to his whims, like Dan Brown or Governor Perry. Chronologies matter. To accuse Burckhardt writing in the 1850s and Yoder writing in 1972 of non-interpreting Constantine and Eusebius, I need to emphasize that, through the new lens Barnes and Drake, 1981 and 2000, have given us in the past generation of scholarship is at least unfair. Critique number 2, and this is going to be shorter. The argument against Yoder, or was the early church uniformly pacifist? Don't miss that word, uniformly. Beginning with page 175, Leithart delivers on the promise he made to introduce in the introduction of the book, namely to provide a sustained critique of Yoder in the Constantinian shift, which he rather be a Constantinian moment. I'm with him in that. I will not defend Yoder here, leaving this task to those who know his work better than I do. Charlie Gollier, for example, an expert in Yoder and Harwas, in a forthcoming review of the book in Pro Ecclesia, praises Leithart for, quote, not only having read Yoder carefully and systematically, but also sympathetically, a rare achievement among Yoder's detractors. Having also subjected Yoder to the scrutiny of Yoder's own avowedly non-Constantinian convictions about taking history seriously, end quote. And Charlie concludes that, quote, Leithart's critique is in key respects Yoderian, and for that reason alone, defending Constantine should be received as one of the most important tributes to Yoder today. The book honors Yoder's deepest convictions by inviting his followers to let go of a major problematic aspect of Yoder's historical narration, end quote. For our purposes, I will focus on a couple of quibbles around the question Leithart asks of the early church, especially his emphasis that those who see the rejection of violence, war, and participation in the military service in the early church as integral to the early church have a much higher standard of proof. Namely, that they have to prove that the rejection of war and military service was supported uniformly or almost uniformly by all Christians before Constantine, pages 258 to 260. While all Leithart has to do per his own statement is, quote, to prove only diversity or ambiguity, end quote, and having proven that, quote, the church was never, his underscore, united in an absolute opposition to Christian participation in war, end quote, his side of the argument has won. After all, he continues, however vigorously intellectuals like Origen and Tertullian opposed service in the army, and whatever their reasons, it is entirely possible that they represented a small, articulate minority that has come to be considered spokesmen only because they had the wherewithal to speak. What did the countless, nameless, and forgotten local pastors think? End quote, page 259. However egalitarian this dilemma may sound, it seems to be simply misleading. For how can we ever know what the countless, nameless, and forgotten pastors might think about anything? An unfortunate fact of history is that, however tragic and unfair, the nameless and forgotten are by default silent. Not only that, if we discount those who wrote, the only ones who have left any witness at all, because they might have been a small, articulate minority, what do we have left of Christian history and faith and practice, let alone Roman history or Greek? More than 2/3 of the New Testament itself was written by two writers from the same circle, Paul and Luke. A small, articulate minority, if there ever was one. The life of a Galilean carpenter was recorded by 4. Simply put, if ubique semper ad omnibus, everywhere, always by all, is the principle by which we judge history, theology, or practice in the early church, if this becomes the interpretive litmus test for the relationship between the principle and rhetorical and the practical, then we end up with another set of mythologized history, mythological constructs replacing the one we try to escape, and come to realize that we cannot make any claims about what Christians believed under any circumstances on any subject ever. Furthermore, admitting as he does that between the Testaments, where we have explicit evidence of Christians in the Roman military, a claim that we'll dispute momentarily, in the latter part of the 2nd century, we hear nothing, again underscore, about Christian soldiers, page 261. Leithart concludes that the silence does not allow us to speak at all. This is what he says. Because we do not know about the practice of the church, we cannot really know about its convictions. Few writers whose works are preserved from the early centuries speak against Christian participation. But do their convictions match the view of the majority of the Christians? What were local pastors saying? We simply cannot know, end quote. Again, if that is the standard, we cannot know whether they baptized converts or gathered together to celebrate the Eucharist, or whether they condoned exposing their children, or as their Roman neighbors did, killed them. Or if they were encouraged to participate in the events of the theater, or even if they confessed Jesus to be God. For all of these, we have but scant evidence from the literati, a small articulate minority that has come to be considered spokesmen only because they had the wherewithal to speak. Wouldn't it be more appropriate to ask the question the opposite way? Do we have any evidence that Christians were actively encouraged to pursue military service as a pious Christian vocation? Or, is there a single writer who promotes or even condones such a practice? The answer is obviously no. To argue from praxis to theology, or from experience to reason to tradition to scripture, is a move even contemporary United Methodists would shy and hesitate to advocate. See, these jokes go better in the Methodist seminary. They don't go well here. It is akin to arguing that because certain Christians also frequented temples and engaged in the customary sacred services available to them, and only a singular voice of a small articulate minority was recorded as objecting to such a practice in the 1st century, 1 Corinthians 16, that temple prostitution, hierodulia, or the frequenting of brothels or prostitution were allowed practices among the multitude simply because we do not have the witness of the multitude and silent pastors of the church. It is not the place for me to present, this is not the place to present the fullness of the Christian attitudes to war and military service, but let me address a singular case, and I close with this. I think the case of Cornelius will suffice to illustrate the point. In Acts 10, 1 through 11:18, Luke presents to us the story of Cornelius, a centurion from the Italian cohort. And the question has often been asked, as Leithart does, here's a great opportunity. Peter didn't say anything. Jesus didn't say anything. John the Baptist didn't say anything. Excellent point. It's a wonderful point. It needs to be addressed. Let me attempt to do that. Leaving aside for a moment the fact that Luke's point in the story is that, quote, as he says in 11:18, God has given even to the Gentiles the repentance that leads to life, and not Cornelius' station, we need to ask what is not being said in the story as much as what is being said. What is being said is clear enough. Cornelius is 1, a Roman, 2, a centurion, 3 of the Italian cohort, even though we have no record of such a cohort in Palestine. We have no idea who these people are. But we were going to assume that they are, as the name says, Italians. That is important. We also know that as a centurion, that is anywhere between a non-commissioned officer and a lieutenant colonel, the Romans had a vast variety of uses for centurions and therefore rankings for them. Cornelius had a very specific, prescribed, and long-standing duties even in peacetime, especially in peacetime. Whether a primus pilus, a centurion of the first cohort, probably in Luke 7:5 and 23:47, or not, Cornelius' military office was not distinguished from the office of acting as a priest, since the person of the officer was representing his unit, a bearer of the emperor cult and state religion, as Tertullian reminds us in on Idolatry 19:1. As such, Cornelius was responsible for executing the required actions. And, as one writer says, All divisions of the imperial army participated in the worship of those gods who had looked after Rome during the rise to world domination. Soldiers, both of the legion and the auxiliary units, were given guidelines on which sacrifice to perform, on what day, and to whom. The soldiers would sacrifice on days of important feasts, etc. And centurions like Cornelius would have been the ones who would perform these sacrifices in front of the assembled cohorts and on their behalf. As a centurion, Cornelius would have to lead his cohort in the offering of the sacramentum, the military oath, a liturgical practice indeed, 3 times every year, even in peace. And here we have to ask, could Cornelius, who had just moved from the ranks of the God-fearers to the newly baptized Christian, confess his Jesus as Kyrios, Lord and Dominus, could he now stand in front of his cohort and offer sacrifices to the gods and proclaim Caesar, Dominus et Deus? If he could, then Luke was wrong. Cornelius did not accept, quote in Acts 10:36, Jesus Christ is Lord of all. And Peter was mistaken and baptized him in the name, capital N. If Cornelius could not stand in front of his cohort and proclaim Caesar Dominus et Deus, then Rome had the answer for him. And it was not simply dismissal from the army. See the Acts of the military martyrs for the consequences of that. The burden of proof, I argue, on the question of why didn't Peter ask Cornelius to leave military service is not on those who see a coherent pacifist stance in the early church, but on those who insist that Luke's silence is somehow condoning the continuation of such a practice, the military service. Why didn't Peter ask Cornelius to leave the military service? The answer seems to me simple enough. Because he didn't have to. Rome would take care of that. It is not true then, as Leithart claims, that the period of silence is evidence of the early church's activity condoning military service, or perhaps indicative that Christians served in the Roman army openly as Christians. In my opinion, this is substantial misreading of the power and attention Rome paid to the religious elements of its army. If Christians could not serve openly in the army as Christians, affirming Caesar as Dominus et Deus thrice a year, how can we argue that the church condoned such a duplicitous stance? As for the years following the mid-2nd century, there is ample witness against participation in the Roman army, or any other army, but I will make the case elsewhere, and my 12 minutes are up. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I think what you witnessed was what happens to a theologian who ventures into an area that he knows too little about to speak authoritatively. That was very helpful, a very helpful critique and response. I do have some responses. All of the detailed historical argumentation, I want a copy of your response so that I can investigate further. But a few things in response. First of all, the question about the popular conception of Constantine and whether by addressing a mid-19th century historical account of Constantine, I'm setting up a straw man. I think that if you were looking at the trends in historical scholarship on Constantine, certainly Burckhardt is long gone. Burckhardt is not considered an authority. What surprised me as I began to investigate began to study for the book was how frequently Burckhardian kinds of arguments and viewpoints about Constantine were appearing in Christian literature from the last decade. The characterization, not necessarily citing Burckhardt, but the characterization of Constantine was indebted to that 19th century conception. And one of the things that struck me was the radical rift, the chasm between what I was reading in theologians, particularly theologians who are talking about Constantine, and what all the historians, secular and Christian historians, are saying about Constantine. So a huge chasm between there. And so part of the book was to try to bring the Christian readers that I expect will be my main readership, to make them aware of that shift, because it's not apparent that even theologians, not just Christian readers, it's not apparent that theologians have recognized that that's old hat in the historical community. I agree with you completely, but I don't think it's a straw man. I think I'm dealing with something that continues to have a good bit of staying power in whatever we want to call the popular imagination. It certainly has staying power in popular Christian writing. And point about Eusebius, that's something, I just accept that as a criticism. I should have been more careful in the way I was using Eusebius. I appreciate that comment. About the countless, the scant evidence that we have of the early church. Your questions that you posed, kind of a reductio, if we don't know about what the pastor said upon this issue, we don't know about what they said about Christology, we don't know what they said about X, Y, Z. I agree with that. That was part of my point, is to show that there are the strong claims that I think Yoder's making. It was a polemical point, a subversive point for Yoder's position. The strong claims that Yoder makes about the early church, I think, are beyond what the evidence bears. And part of the argument against that was to suggest that there's a great deal more going on than we will ever have conception of, ever have evidence for, or certainly do not have evidence for right now. So I agree with the reductio, and that was the point of the argument, to try to subvert the confident claims that Yoder is making about that consensus. On Acts 10, again, very helpful details about the role of the centurion in the Roman army. Just remind you that prior to Cornelius converting, he is a Gentile God-fearer who is pleasing to God in the position of being a Roman centurion, doing all the things that you said Roman centurions do. But Luke says that he's pleasing to God. That also has to be factored into what we're thinking about Cornelius and what happens in that passage. You started out by noting the fact that he's singled out as a Gentile convert, which is certainly the important point in the story of Acts. But the information about his station is there, and I think that's the fact that Roman centurions are coming into the Christian church, and that you have a Roman centurion who could function as a Gentile God-fearer, pleasing to God prior to that, it's a meaningful point against Yoder's position. Okay. Questions for either of us, I guess? Yeah.
Can I take this? Very useful.
You're in charge.
In the Roman army, there are two categories of religion: sanctioned and private. Private Roman soldiers, centurions, and anybody else are allowed to practice whatever religion they want in private. But baptism is a public event. Now the private becomes public. And whatever God-fear means before, the question is now in the baptism in the name, can't he now, because before he has not confessed Jesus as Lord, now he has. Now he has a different Lord. That's the point. Secondly, Canon 13 of Hippocrates reminds us that there are two categories of soldiers. Those who convert as soldiers and want to be baptized, and we have to deal with them. And the second category, as Canon 13 says, is those catechumens who confess that they wish to then, after baptism, go and join the military. And the prescription for that is they're just silly. Just kick them out, because they don't understand what they're doing. So we're talking about two categories that need to be taken. And what I think Yoder, on the one hand, overstates the case, but on the other hand, we cannot ask for uniformity in such a pluriform society as the early church. My question is, do we have opposite voices, not practices, but voices, who say this pious Christian practice, go and do it? I haven't found that. If we find it, tell me.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Dr. Leithart, I'm curious about your comment that we either embrace some form of Christendom or basically cede all power to a non-Christian political order, which you're identifying with political liberalism. Particularly particularly in light of your comparison of the church to Israel being baptized in the Red Sea and so forth. Because as I read Augustine, especially in the narrations of the Psalms, and you see the Son and City of God as well, his primary metaphor for the church's relation to the world is captivity. And it has to do with the Babylonian captivity, which is a very curious metaphor because on the one hand, in the Babylonian captivity, you have Daniel and his friends who rise in power. And that's sort of an example in certain ways of Theodosius, of whom Augustine speaks very positively at the end of Book 5, City of God. But these are very ad hoc situations. You have a non-Christian within the church, you have a Christian within Rome. There's a very strong exhortation in narrations on not allowing the love of Babylon to take over your heart. Your primary loyalty should be to the church. And a very strong emphasis on the identity of the church, the City of God, which I think are pretty closely identified as a pilgrim people. I mean, that's every page of City of God. So where would you fit that in between, Christendom versus political liberalism or ceding all authority to the secular? Because it does seem that he wants him to exercise influence. He does think Christian rulers would be beneficial in those positions, but it's not the normal situation, and there's always sort of a tendentious position that the Christian has in that kind of situation.
A couple of directions that I come at. One is I don't know that exile is, I think exile in one respect might be a description of the Christian place in the world from here to the end. I'm not sure that that's, as a paradigm of the Christian political presence, I'm not convinced that is the permanent situation of the Christian church. So that would be, I'd probably be just a disagreement with Augustine that you can use that exilic language as just a universal description of what's happening. Along a similar kind of line, just to buttress that somewhat exegetically, I think you have in Daniel 7, in the way that the shape of the book of Revelation develops, you have Daniel 7 particularly, you have the dominion and power and rule of the empires, the bestial empires that are defeated by the Son of Man, given to the saints. So the promise that's given in Daniel 7 is not just of continuing to exist in an exilic period, but when this period of imperial rule is over, this dominion is going to belong to the saints in some fashion or other. And I think that's the same kind of shape that you have in Revelation, where it's the martyrs who end up on thrones at the end. So what that looks like in practice, I think, when I say advocate or support some form of Christendom, I'm not talking that I'm not endorsing everything that has historically gone under the name of Christendom. I'm not endorsing every particular contour of political life that the West has seen. What I'm talking about rather is that there's Christendom in the basic sense that you have a public acknowledgement of Jesus as Lord, and that's part of the nation of a people's political order, that they acknowledge that they have a king beyond whatever king or ruler they might have. So it's a pretty baseline definition of Christian that I'm using, but and on the Augustinian point, I think I just disagree with Augustine there.
My first statement was that I come from a part of the world where Constantine was a saint, equal with the apostle. Right. And I would much rather we use the term, as you used in the lecture, public Christianity instead of Christendom. Because that is a historical connotation with it.
Thank you for your lecture. One of the things I was really intrigued by was the point you made at the end about basically the reintroduction of sacrifice in the modern state, especially with respect to people operating their very lives in the context of war for the sake of the state. I was just wondering, could you speak to the ethics of patriotism, and in particular, love of country as a valid motive for going to war? I'm thinking in particular of World War II veterans who go to war because of the love of America and what it stands for. Am I sensing the radicalness of your statement and calling this modern sacrifice of human life am I sensing the radicalness correctly when I'm understanding that that kind of motive is actually inconsistent with a truly Christian identity as somebody who's ultimately a citizen of heaven?
I threw that out largely for provocation, less for as something that I can offer an answer to. But you rightly sense the radical intention of the statement. A couple of things that might qualify that. The first is I follow Augustine on this point. Follow Augustine on many points, and among them would be this one. That there's a certain proper love for those who are nearest to you. There's a certain hierarchy of loves, and one of the loves that we have is a love for the people of which we're a part, and I think that's a valid and that's a natural, that's a healthy and good thing. It's an extension, as Augustine says, you have a hierarchy of neighbors, and I think it's an extension of love of neighbor that you have a collection of neighbors who identify together as a particular people. So I'm not, to that extent, I think patriotism is defensible in a Christian framework. The reason for bringing up the sacrificial questions about the modern state is I think that our conceptions of what being part of the church means in a modern society, maybe particularly for Americans, are radically distorted. The notion that we would be willing, as an American Christian, you'd be willing to be martyred rather than, and in opposition to the state, rather than being being willing to sacrifice yourself for America. That sounds very strange to us. It's a very hard thing for us to accept. But that's the shift that Kahn is describing from the early church, where you have martyrdom for the sake of Christ. That's a sacrifice over against state power, and that's been co-opted by the state. That's all part of a theory about state sovereignty and the notion of the popular sovereign that is, I think many historians would acknowledge that this also is kind of a displacement of theological concepts. So now the sovereign is the one who has the authority authority of life and death. And who has the authority of life and death in the modern world? The state does have that authority to command us to kill and to be killed. I don't know how that all works out. I have as instinctive support for America as any American, but I think that that's something that we need to feel the radical impact of that, because I think that's our whole political outlook is, I think, radically distorted because we've accepted that position as, even as Christians, we've accepted that position as our willingness to sacrifice is mainly a patriotic one. I was trying to provoke, I suppose. Over here.
Piggybacking on that point, the narrative that you offered at the end, thank you for the book, by the way. I think it broaches a badly needed conversation. Having studied in seminaries across the kind of theological spectrum, the issues that you touch on are very real, at least in popular theological discourse. So I've sat through many seminars where these questions are constantly batted around, whether they're history or their theology. So thank you for that. But getting back to this narrative of the nation state that you offered at the very end, I wonder, is the nation state really as unique? I'm thinking back to the clashes between the popes and the royal power throughout the medieval period. How idolatry was a constant temptation there. The Holy Roman emperors to take power, to use their power and their soldiers to kill in the name of. It seems to me that at least that was a temptation for them as well. So I wonder if it's as unique as the current theological narrative that maybe people like Kavanaugh or Milbank or people who want to want to make that argument about the kind of uniqueness. I wonder if that's maybe overstated.
That's quite possible. We should probably ask our historian about that. I think that there is something that is unique about the modern state. I'm thinking about unique. If we start the narrative for the purpose of this discussion with Constantine, what's happening in modern states, and I think about the U.S. in particular, is a political system that does not acknowledge in America, that does not acknowledge the church as any kind of public counterweight to the state, that doesn't that assumes and claims a kind of absoluteness, maybe implicit in many cases, but it assumes a kind of absoluteness that I don't think. Certainly, medieval kings could not have made those claims unchallenged. And that's, I know that there's even in modern political systems, there are martyrs and quasi-martyrs. Think of the role of the Catholic Church in the collapse of the Soviet system, and the willingness to risk life in opposition to a tyrannical state that was motivated and inspired in many cases by John Paul II and by Roman Catholic bishops and so on. So we still have those examples but I think that the claims of the modern state are in the history of the West are unique. The temptations I think are always there. I think the claims to sovereignty are new. Sometime this is just going to collapse in a heap.
Just to see does the picture you're painting of the modern state that's compelling, but is it complicated if one considers that particular wars that a modern state fight might be seen as justified under the just war tradition? And so one of the criteria being just cause would suggest that patriotism alone can't account, or national interest alone can't account for a soldier's death. So there's one part of it. There must be something beyond the state that one gestures toward to justify it. And then the second bit of that, or the second question, is it more complicated in a state which has a volunteer army, in which, for instance, a Christian might see his or her military job as answering faithfully a divine call to a particular vocation? Do those mitigate?
Yeah, I'd have to think about more about both of those, and I think they do complicate what I'm talking about. I think on the first point, just want to state a position. I do believe in an advocate of just war theory, so I'm not a pacifist, but and that does imply a certain kind of what you're seeking to achieve is not just preservation of the state, but something beyond that. My problem, and this is Yoder's very, very powerful question to just war theory, have just war theorists ever found a war they don't like? And that, I think, that seems to me to be, again, part of the dislocation that we've had in modern political life. That you do have, again, you always have qualifications to pose. You have statements coming from various church bodies evaluating wars by just war criteria, but they have very little weight on the decision to go to war. And in certain sectors of the church, there's very little actual reflection on the justice of the war, if it can be, well, not even proven, if there's enough war agitation. So I'm a just war advocate, and partly for the reasons that you stated, but I want just war to actually discriminate and decide whether there really is justice to be achieved.
Piggyback on the piggyback and see if you Sure, go ahead.
There's one more question after this that has to be different. And you know what? I'll pick which one it is. So, after Dr. Kalantzis goes, I'll pick the last question.
It's a combination of answers on the just war. First of all, a just war truly has to be a just war. There are not 3 criteria in just war, at least historically. There are 9 criteria. And very rarely do you ever see anyone, including recent past, go past the 3rd. And you go, what happened with the other 6? And by Grotius' account, when you come all the way down to the 9th, almost no war can ever be fought. Because one of the criteria is love of enemy. You have to love your enemy, as you put a bullet in his head. That's now how we train armies. Because medieval armies and early armies are accountable to the church in the West, to the state in the East. And that's a second difference. The East, Byzantine, and by East I mean the Byzantine Empire, does not have a concept of holy war, which permeates medieval Europe from before the Reformation, before the Crusades, through the Crusades. The Byzantines understand the old Roman practice that a just war is always in defense of the honor of the state. And whether that is this, that, or the other, we can talk about that. Secondly, up to the Enlightenment, secular, what we call secular state, is always sacralized state. And that's where the sacrifice idea is very, very important. And I would hope to develop that is being developed a little bit further. That the sovereign is not a sovereign by popular acclaim or vote. Nobody votes about a king. Charlemagne is coronated by the Pope, or one of the bishops who claims authority. So a sovereign is not a sovereign of a state, but has divine sovereignty, representative of Christ himself. No modern state would make such a claim. Actually, on the contrary, the only states that make such a claim, not for Christ, but divine power, are states that would claim to be terrorists. Because we don't like the divine claim. Allahu Akbar is the crime of claiming that sovereignty of God. So we have to be very careful when we tread into those waters, not to confuse ancient or medieval and modern, post-Enlightenment categories. Those are very, very different worlds. The sacralized space of the early, or of the Roman, the Greek, and the medieval state has a singular ruler, and that is God or the gods, whose goal is the pax, the peace of the state. So the state represents the peace that the gods give it. No modern state would claim that.
All right. You're the last one.
Okay, this is actually a question for both of you, but it's based upon what you said, Dr. Wagner. You had spoken about the time of Constantine, the system of Roman law favored the wealthy and well-born, and there was a shift of power to bishops in the court system. My question for the both of you is, do you consider that to be necessary or wise, and why?
I think it was. Are you asking about Constantine doing that, or about whether the church should have courts and legal system?
I suppose maybe it shouldn't have been as ambiguous. I was more focused about Constantine, but the church also, which Christianity was being represented.
Yeah. On Constantine, I'll make a comment about that, and then I'll talk more broadly about it. I think in Constantine's case, I think he's recognizing. He's not the first to recognize it by any means. The Roman emperors had tried to address some of the inequities of the Roman judicial system for a long time before Constantine. But Constantine, I think, by giving the right of appeal to church courts, does open up an actual avenue for addressing the issue that no one else did, and I think that's a good thing. The church has already had certain kinds of courts before that. It's just you get a lot more business coming in once Constantine. And I'm an advocate of that. I think certainly could find flaws with this, but the earliest legal systems in the West are systems that develop as part of canon law, and a lot of the judicial practices that we take for granted are first formulated and practiced in the church. So I think, and I would defend that on the basis of various. From Old Testament patterns of appeals courts between elders that Moses sets up, and I think in the New Testament you have the beginnings of something like that that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians. Aren't you? You're going to judge angels, aren't you able to judge the smallest matter? So I think how that works out in particular cases, how that works out in relation to civil courts, I think there may be some things that need to be, there would be questions there, but whether the church should have its own litigation, its own possibility for reconciliation and mediation, I think that's a very healthy thing for the church to do.
Beginning with the last part, and agreeing completely that because the primary responsibility, at least in the scriptural narrative, is reconciliation among brethren or kin, ecclesiastical courts that are binding. Because if I don't like what my ecclesiastical court, my elders do in my church, what I do is either appeal to the state or to supersede them, or leave the church and go to another church. But we have to have a system that is binding. But let me say, and that's equivalent for another point, the 10 to 15% Christian population, empire-wise maybe, but in urban centers from the late second, middle of the third century, definitely by the Decian persecution, Christians are much more numerous. Alexandria, Carthage, Rome, Antioch, Ephesus. Well, Ephesus has moved a little bit by that time. And the bishops already function as such. We see this in epistle after epistle of Cyprian, in which he arbitrates between. The second part is that Christians then, most often, do not appeal to the secular courts because they could be accused, most often, of being Christians, and therefore lose every right to property, not often life, but to property. So these were always Christian on Christian debates, not Christian on pagan debates. What Constantine does, he now makes the Christian to pagan debate also applicable to the court. Julian will negate that, and then it will come back. The bigger problem here is not just the ecclesial authority or episcopal authority, which develops in the first 4 centuries. Ignatius of Antioch has zero episcopal authority, almost zero, though he's called a bishop, to the Constantinian. It is, what does that mean now for the church? And I would agree wholeheartedly that it is not Constantine who subordinates the church to the state. It is the church that abdicates its place as a public Christian witness to the state. And by doing so, it loses its ability to be a mirror to the state and say, this is how you do this. And therefore it's corrupted by it. Eventually, it will be, I mean, think of the Theban legion, think of the Christian legions, right? We magnify and say, see Christians in the army. The legions are somewhere between 3 and 8 to 10,000, depending on the period. But there's another as many auxiliaries, including all the brothels that come around, and the loan sharks that come around, and the et cetera, et cetera. So these are industries around the camp. Does the church own those now? You own the courts. Why don't you own the brothels? So it's like the car. I mean, the dog that chases the car. Every time I go by my neighborhood, I want to stop when my neighbor's dog is out and say, okay, you caught the car. Now what are you going to do with it? And that's what happens during this time.
Let's thank them.